Sophie Andrews, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Law. I'm here to introduce your speaker today, your lecturer. And the title of this lecture is The Road from the 2016 Local Elections. So if you weren't expecting this lecture, you have to be in another lecture room. So it is my pleasure, it's a very short introduction because you can find Dr. Zwelethu Jolobe. He has a PhD in political studies from UCT, and he joined the political studies department at the beginning of 2005, even though he looks like he just graduated from high school. Am I allowed to say that?
It's fine.
Yeah. At my age now, everybody looks like they graduated from high school. So his research area includes comparative politics, international relations, African politics, political violence, revolutions, contemporary South African politics, and democratization. So you know he's got all the material in the world that's been happening in the last 2 years, the last 10 years, 20 years, and it's my pleasure to introduce him. I will take questions at the end of his talk.
Yes, that's right. Okay, hello everybody. Good to be here again. And can you all hear me? Yes, okay. Louder. Is that better? Yeah? Okay, well, let's see how it goes. I gave a version of this lecture at the beginning of last year when I was asked to look at the local elections. And I made some predictions. And I was told that I should rather come back here and see how things turned out, and to also, give a sort of long-term view about how things are more likely to evolve. And so I'm with you. Oh, sorry. Sure. Yeah. And now?
No, even more.
Yes, it's on. Yeah. Is that better? Oh, great, excellent. And so I'm going to be with you guys for 2 days. And my lecture series will do exactly that. So this lecture, I'm going to sort of go over some of the assumptions that I made last year, because I'm sure there are some people who were not here then and who I think will benefit from this. And so I will go over mainly the way that I approach my predictions. That is, what I look at. And I will then look at the result and what the result means for this election, so last year's election. And then my lecture series tomorrow will look at the road to the 2019 general election, meaning based on what the trends are, that is before last year's local election, and based on the outcome, what are the possibilities, right? And so there are three things that I will look at. And the first one is I will interrogate this notion of whether or not we're seeing a resurgent opposition. Is it really happening, or is it a dud, right? Is the DA becoming a different animal or not? And can we take the EFF seriously, right? And this is important because the DA and the EFF are in a partnership, and I cannot think of two more opposed sides who can agree on the fundamentals of politics governing, right? And this, I think, says a lot about the type of system we have. The second thing I'll look at is the fallout inside the ANC. And I think that this we get on the news every day, right? The ANC got a bad result and are in a sort of long, extended process of just dealing with emotions, right? And there are a variety of things. The president on the one hand, the lack of turnout on the other hand. And I want to know, well, is this something significant? Or is this just the kind of ugly decline of a Zuma era that could lead to the rebirth of something else, right? And the third thing I will look at is this issue around succession, which has affected the ANC on the one hand, but we also cannot remove it out of DA politics, Right? The DA now has got a group of very young and ambitious leaders who may appear to cooperate during fun times, but come federal Congress, we could see something quite different, right? And so tomorrow's lecture will be more along the lines of predictions, what is possible. Now, last year, my pre-election analysis was based on it was based on 4 key assumptions. And I said that, once all the pomp and ceremony and the journalistic discussions are gone, there are really 4 important things to look for in any election, right? And the first one I said was turnout, meaning who shows up on the day in an election. So you can draw as much people in a rally, right? It doesn't mean that all those people are going to vote. So what we look for is who is on the books, and out of those people on the books, who votes, right? And last year, we looked at some interesting trends. And the first one we looked at was that the number of people who are registered is on the increase. That's very true, right? But at the same time, the people of voting age are also on the increase, which means that there is a very interesting deficit if we compare people on the books and those who could potentially be on the books, right? And this obviously affects results. So, for example, if we look at the major metros, what we see are, firstly, low levels of voter turnout, right? Which basically means that if we take the whole pool of people of voting age, very few people are showing up to vote. Right? Meaning, even if we take, say, people who are registered, it's really half of people who are registered who actually show up in elections. Right? And this is significant because the way that people tell the story here is 77% turnout, it's great, it's wonderful, but if we actually look at the amount of people who could be on the books, it's quite a small figure. Right? And this, I said last year, means therefore that we have a much larger swing vote in this country than we believe. Right? And once again, what I did here is that I looked at the 2009 and the 2014 general election as a barometer. And I said, well, if we look at, say, the one event where most people tend to show up more than others, it's big general elections. The election of Zuma twice. What we see here is once again the same trend, right? In the sense that if we take the number of people who were on the books in 2009, about, say, close to 18 million out of 23 million show up. Right? The story gets even more interesting if we look at, well then, out of those who are on the books, and out of those people who, vote for the governing party, how many do? Fascinating, right? Less than half of people who are registered voted for the winning party. Right? Once again, the number of people who are on the books but didn't show up is more than double those that voted for all opposition parties. Which means, therefore, that people are clearly registered, right? Meaning they go through all the time and effort to be on the books and whatnot, but they don't show up in elections. Which means, therefore, that the swing vote is a lot bigger than we think it is. And that the existing parties are not offering the electorate what they want. I mean, it gets worse if we put this thing up against a conservative estimate of people of voting age. It means that 11 million people out of over 30 million voted for the majority party. Right? Once again, the trend repeats itself. 2014, same trend. We have a rise in the amount of people who are on the books, meaning people, once again, make the effort to register and do all that stuff. Right? Once again, we have a slight increase in the amount of people who cast their vote, and those who vote for parties is the same pattern. Right? 11.4 million people out of 25 million vote for the winning party. The parties are not offering what people want. Right? And this is the sort of first two trends that we looked at going into the local election. Now, the third trend has to do with the kind of macro view, right? And this is how we think about the party system. And the question that I asked last year was that if you have this dynamic, which is lots of people on the books who just would rather choose to stay at home, to say, you know what, I don't like what I see, I'm disillusioned, I'm just going to go home and have a braai and do all these things. But that means that the potential for a shift is there. And so in as much as we call ourselves a one-party dominant system, we are in fact one that is on very, very weak legs and had the potential, I said, to move to a more competitive multi-party system if people shift their voting preferences. Right? And this was the big question that I looked at. And in terms of defining what it is, I said that a moderate multi-party system is one where you have 3 to 5 parties that are relevant, right? By that I mean they either have to have government potential, right? Or they have to have what I would call blackmail potential, meaning what they do affects the behavior of larger parties, right? And that the system must be characterized by alternate coalitions. Now, if one looks at this framework, I think that we are less of a one-party dominant system than, say, Mexico was, or, say, India was, or Taiwan, Sweden, because there is a national opposition party that has, or that controls a province and controls a metro, meaning it actually governs and uses tax rands, etc. Right? So we're more of a competitive dominant party system. And the question therefore was, well, could this change, right? And if it would change, where would that change be? And this was where the prediction was that given these questions, there were 3 potential areas where things could shift. Johannesburg, Tshwane, and Port Elizabeth. Right, each for different reasons that I will explain in depth a bit later. The Joburg trends towards this election were interesting, right? On the one hand, we saw a trend where over time, ANC support from, say, 2009 was on the decline, right? And it wasn't so much that less people were voting for them, it was more that the rate at which people were voting for ANC was declining relative to the rate of people voting for DA, right? Which says a lot about turnout, meaning the ANC began to struggle to get their members out to vote on the day. By contrast, the DA just shot up, right? And obviously here there are different reasons, right? With the ANC, it was their own internal issues, the Mbeki to Zuma shift. By contrast with the DA, they shifted from Zilla to Maimane, which was more of an age issue as opposed to a race issue, It was that you had a much younger, energetic group of people who, on age, average, were in their mid to late 30s. By contrast, ANC, they were all in their 60s. Right? Huge shift in the way that people respond to this. Tshwane, we had the same trend. The rate at which people vote for ANC on the decline. Right? And the same thing we saw in PE. Right? So we had these three areas that we said, well then, if there is to be the beginning of something, it will be in big cities. And it would have to do with the way that parties get their people out to vote or to show up on the day. Right? And from this, we had three predictions. Our first one would be that any result for the ANC will depend on, therefore, whether they can get their members out on the day. Right? And this obviously is for many reasons. Secondly, the same would apply for the DA and the EFF. But we weren't sure about the EFF. We didn't know then. We didn't know who they were, how they would play a local election, and all these things. Right? And I think that the gamble that I made was that I assumed, that we would have a predictable result, meaning that result would keep the ANC in power in the metros, but at declining levels. Right? Nobody predicted a worst case scenario for the ANC. Not even me. I thought they would at least hold it somewhere. Meaning you would do badly, yes, but you would do badly in a way in which you would still retain power in metros. This obviously doesn't happen. In this election, ANC loses 4 major metros. It loses the capital city, the biggest city in Africa, and the second biggest city. Right? And once again, the trends are the same everywhere. Johannesburg, you have a minority DA-led government. Minority meaning that the party that governs in the end doesn't get an absolute majority. So it needs the assistance of somebody else to elect a mayor, a speaker, and all these things. And for me, what interests me was the difference between the amount of votes for the ANC and the DA. Right? It's less than 100,000 people, which in previous years, it would have been, exorbitant. Right? The EFF is a no-show in this election. Right? Meaning the level of support that they get is pretty much consistent with their 2014 general election. Once again, we look at Tshwane. The DA gets more votes numerically than the ANC. Right? A shift has happened. That perhaps, and we can talk about it, but something happened in this election. Right? And once again, Eastern Cape, you have DA more votes than ANC. And so therefore, based on this, I think that there are a number of findings that are key. And the first one is that the ANC hasn't gone away. Right? It may be experiencing a serious hit in the elections, but it still remains an important player in local government politics. That is, it still has government and coalition potential. The shift, however, is that you have 2 additional parties that now have become relevant. You have the DA, which actually runs metros, right? Meaning it no longer just has black male potential, firstly. It no longer is just relevant within the Western Cape, but its influence has spread. and not only in terms of vote share, but in terms of controlling metropolitan governance, right? Budgets, refuse collection, fixing roads, the list goes on, right? Secondly, the EFF has shown that it has got coalition potential, which makes it, even though from a numerical point of view, is not as significant, but it did propel the DA into power. And that is significant. And so therefore, what we can conclude is that based on or at a local level, the country is no longer a one-party dominant system. It's not. That's gone. It's simply a moderate multi-party. I use the word moderate because it's not polarized. Right? The fact that the EFF and the DA can be partners means that those points that we think are extreme, right? Malema, Maimane, or people who talk about nationalization, free market, and if they can agree on the basic principle of politics, power, it means that the system is really not that polarized. Right? It's not Pakistan, for instance, or Afghanistan, right, where you can have the Taliban on the one hand, and then a Communist Party on the other hand, and then a liberal party who don't agree on anything, right? The fourth is that this notion of coalition governance has creeped into our system, in the sense that parties have found ways of forming partnerships, which could affect the way in which parties, from a pragmatic point of view, approach a hung parliament, if that happens in 2019. Right? It's become a political culture, right? And the fourth thing is that the fact that, once again, you have a DA-EFF partnership means that you no longer have anti-system parties. If Malema and Maimane can meet and find agreement, right, it means that from the extreme poles, there's a basis for consensus politics, which is what we want. Right. The next question, going into or sort of flowing into the sort of discussion for tomorrow, is then how did the ANC lose the metros? Because what I think is that how the ANC lost the metros is going to affect their politics going forward, and could potentially mean that if things remain the same, we'll see a similar result in 2019, with similar trends and patterns. It might not be an ANC loss at the polls, right? But it could be one that significantly shapes or shifts how vote share has been in the last 20 years. And I think that there are three main reasons why, right? And I'll explain them in the three big metros. The first one is very basic: the failure to respond to the concerns of people. That's simple, right? And that's purely an issue of governance, firstly, and it plagues every dominant party in the world, from the Mexicans to Malaysia. Same trend after 15, 20 years. You know, power and a sort of a climate of uncompetitive politics creates people who are just moderate. You don't have to be excellent. There's no accountability. There's no questioning, and people get away with murder, right? When that happens, you no longer think that, hey, actually, we must collect this refuse every Friday, or we must fix that pothole. Small things like that. Once they accumulate, it creates this mistrust between ordinary citizens and those people who lead them. Not the big stuff, the small stuff, right? The second one, which is linked to the first, was conflict within local ANC branches. over very, very mundane issues, meaning who should get a job at that council. And you fight over this. You have lists over who should be the engineer. Not because you got a degree from UCT to know, but because if you get that job, then my likelihood of getting promoted is increased. Right? Once again, you bicker amongst yourselves, which obviously in turn affects the very basic social contract. Right? And the third one, which is all linked, are the ways in which national tensions converge. Right? So people in the end, when you have a climate where leaders fail to respond to basic local problems, people take their fight elsewhere. And then you can't respond, and then things fall apart. You throw rocks, you burn tires, you scream, and all these things. Right? And it is the way that all these three things played together. And these issues really were not rocket science. Right? If we take Port Elizabeth, once again, I don't understand how one can mismanage R1 billion in a small town like PE. I have no idea. Right? But the implications of that were so serious in PE that people no longer trusted their local ANC, to the point where the ANC was forced to disband their whole regional membership. You had an implosion in PE. A spectacular one, where the only way out was a different party. Right? And obviously this is the context of the Eastern Cape, where you had a recurring theme in governance. And I think that what happened is that it was the sort of the general accumulation of this that led people to just say, well, if it means that we go for Trollop, then so be it. And that's where they went. Right? Johannesburg, I think, was more specific. So PE, I think, was a gradual issue in which, over time, issues accumulate. But Joburg was very, very, very clear in the sense that once you impose e-tolls on people who can't afford it, the result was probably, I think, the largest civil disobedience campaign since the end of apartheid, where people refused. Just said, you know what, I won't buy my e-tags. And I think that the way that the government dealt with this is that they saw it as a class issue, right? So they said that, well, actually, because e-tolls are for cars, right, and that most people who are poor take taxis, it's rich people who have got issues. But what they forget is that Joburg doesn't have a good, massive public transport system, meaning most people buy inexpensive cars and drive long distances. Right? From Soweto, you drive on the N1 to the M1, and you get charged an exorbitant amount of money that you can't afford. And this, I think, was simple. Motorists refused, and people in this case, unlike PE, simply refused to turn out for the election. They were like, they were like, we told you we don't want e-tolls. They said, no, you'll have it. They said, no, yes, well then I'm not going to vote. What? And then Tshwane was also a very specific issue in which, while we all know that Ramu Khopa wasn't a good mayor, right? The ANC there did not leave it up to the citizens of Tshwane to decide who a good mayor should be. And simply, and it's a deployment policy where you then take whom you think is suitable, a person from Durban, to go become the mayor of Pretoria, who can't speak Bedi or Tswana or Sotho, and expect them to disagree, right? The important thing here was the way that people in Pretoria responded to this, right? They took their fight outside of the ANC, burning buses, looting shops, just general state of frustration. And the moment that happened, right, the fight was lost. You've lost people, right? Once again, the party turned away from the electorate, who in turn voted them out of office. That's what explains Pretoria, more people voting DA there than, say, Johannesburg, where more people voted for the ANC, but at a slower rate. And so therefore, to conclude this lecture, and what's going to set us up for tomorrow's lecture, is what are we likely to see in the road to 2019. And I think that here we can divide it from the ANC on the one hand and the opposition. For the ANC, what has plagued them, I would say maybe in the last 15 years, is bad governance. But I think that it is bad governance that is a consequence of not having competition. When you don't have a good competitor, you don't need to do that much every day. That's simple. Because if you have one, the cost of not doing much is leaving office. And so the ANC spend 15 years knowing that they'll win anyway. Right? In the end, people will look at an ANC election to think about the next president. That's the extent of it. And that does not breed good governance. And that's what detaches people from the experiences of communities. Right? You don't have to do that much. And the question here, therefore, is that if things remain the same, we expect the same trends. And all evidence has pointed towards that in the last 8 years. Right? The second thing is a fallout after the election. And this is where the blame game begins. And this is where you have power shifts. In that if you look at where the ANC loses, it's all urban areas. It is metropolitan areas. Our population is becoming more urban than rural, right? Which means, therefore, and two, is becoming younger, right? And urban areas are in turn the main centers of money, which means the more you lose support in urban areas, the more it's going to impact on the bigger picture. And so how the fallout plays out will depend on how you plan for next year. And I'll talk about the two big groups inside the ANC. But to sort of briefly talk about it now is that you really have two groups that are in many ways defined by geography, right? You have rural barons who control, Mpumalanga and Northwest and Northern Cape, who have found, innovative ways of holding on to power, right? By contrast, you have a group of urban leaders who are simply losing the electorate. So power is shifting towards this more interesting group that doesn't have that big picture, which will affect competition in the context of rising opposition, right? And so the real question for the ANC is what happens in its 2017 National Congress. If all things remain equal, right, meaning if we see the same behavior, we see the same result as the locals. For the opposition, however, I think that there are sort of three broad areas that we can look at. And the first one is how this new partnership, if we are to call it that, between EFF-DA on the one hand and all other parties pans out. And most importantly, to what extent does it extend to national parliament? if it does, right? Both parties at the moment are quite at pains to point out that they're not in a coalition. They always say it, right? But on most matters in Parliament, it's clear that there is an anti-ANC group of which the two of them lead. Right? And the more this happens, the more or the closer they get as partners. Right? And this will have a huge impact on their party congresses and whether their constituencies want them to continue with this. And so at the moment, yes, there's chemistry between Maimane and Malema, right? Both are urban-based people. Both groups come from Wits University or come from Wits or UCT and KZN. They're all in about the same age group. They're all between, say, 35 and 38. And so they're all part of the same generation, right? Which makes sense in that they can have different views but work together. But they're not really representative of their organizations. Which means that you might find people in the DA and the EFF who don't agree on this partnership. And the question is, will this play itself out at the next DA Federal Congress? Where there was a challenger to Maimane, who maybe didn't get the same amount of votes, but his group looks very differently from Maimane's group. Right? It's a much older group of people who won't really go to Long Street with EFF guys and have shooters on a Friday. Which I think is what creates the basis for Malema and Maimane, in that, you know, they can say, let's have a pint together and talk about this. Fine. It's very, very different. And so based on this, I won't continue because tomorrow and time-wise, these are the items going forward. I think now I want to open it up and take questions and discussion.
Take a few questions.
Sure, yeah, no problem. Yeah.
We'll take three at a time. Doing three.
To what extent do you feel that the state capture issue has been swept under the carpet and is potentially a major issue in the next election going forward? If something is not done about it.
Will you repeat the questions?
Okay. So how has the state capture issue affected the elections? And what was the second part of your question again? Future.
Things going forward. Things going forward.
So state capture.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Zwelethu. I have two quick questions. The first is the ANC managed to hold on to what are sort of turbo rural provinces, right? And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts as to whether their ability to hold on to those provinces says something about the ANC or if it says something about who the rural voter is.
Sure.
The second quick question is, what are the real chances of seeing sort of an ANC rallying, right? So if before 2019
Yeah.
they make a big move and they get rid of the president,
Yeah.
would they be able to rally in order to sort of hit back in 2019?
Okay.
I'm going to need you to summarize before you answer the question.
Yes.
How's that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll do it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll summarize the question.
To what extent do you think the worldwide trend to vote against the elite and the establishment could play out in 2019?
Okay.
So there's three.
I'll start.
We'll take three
Yeah,
at a time.
yeah. I'll start with the first question. And the first question was that to what extent is this state capture issue, or did it affect the elections, and its importance going forward? I think that the state capture issue for me is not new at all. If we are to take the family concerned, right, which is the Gupta family, I think the one brother was also a member of Thabo Mbeki's working group. So now this goes back, I don't know, Mbeki was in power when, early 2000s and whatnot. And then, and so, and I mean, then you sort of add on a lot of the kind of major beneficiaries of things like BEE, right? So people like Motsepe and, you know, Turkish Ahwale, etc. That was the same pattern as state capture, meaning it was that relationship between a president and his group and very wealthy barons whom you give favors to, so whom you give business to in return for favors, right? And the favors, both in the Mbeki era and in the Zuma era, had to do with party funding and finance. Right? And so people like the Guptas, Patrice Motsepe, even Ramaphosa, were very wealthy financial barons who had, maybe under the Mbeki era, a much more sophisticated and a much more, you know, you can sort of swallow it down relationship than in a Zuma context, where, you know, things are, if we look at the kind of the Sheikh trial, for instance, it's a much more incestuous and raw relationship that knows no boundaries, which makes it more explicit, firstly, meaning it's so obvious, and also, you know, less classy, if you like. Whereas I think that if you look at it in the Mbeki era, you had the same dynamic. It wasn't no different at all. I think how it affects matters going forward is that you now have a new dynamic where you have rival commercial interests that finance rival party factions. And those who win are rewarded, those who lose out. And so it's added a whole new dimension to it, which is why, you know, you have a cope after Mbeki versus Zuma fight, why you have an EFF after that fight, and why potentially you could have another split after this fight. If, once again, all things remain equal. If things change, and obviously they change and it's great and, you know, wonderful, but I think that we assume that people don't learn from their behavior, and this we've seen, and so that's how it's gonna play out. Your question, I think, was about how will the ANC hold it together? Sorry, repeat.
So it was just if they did something like remove the president, would they be able to rally for 2019?
Oh, I see. Yes. Okay, yes. The first question was, will things change if Zuma is removed before 2019? I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, but I'll explain that. I think the answer is no, because Zuma is not the problem. Zuma is simply a symptom of a bigger problem, I think. And so you may remove Zuma and, put whoever you want to put in there, Jeff, Mkhad, Debe, etc. And they will just inherit the same thing. Now, whether or not they will have the courage to do something different, I don't know. But from where I sit, the problems in the ANC are not about individual people, but are systemic problems. It's to do with how they elect their own people, for instance. It has to do with how they reach the decisions, how you govern those rules. It's quite a systemic issue. And I think that for me, the only way that people ever change behavior is if they lose significantly. Because if you don't lose, why change it? Now, is the vote in a rural area a different one? I think that the way that parties are organized, the way that the ANC is organized in a rural area is very different from an urban area. Because in a rural area, you don't have, firstly, a strong civil society, right? Secondly, you don't have other industry that employs people except for the government, right? And you have higher rates of unemployment, and people are dependent on government work, government grants, government jobs for everything. Which means, therefore, that controlling that government is the zero sum. It's the be and end all. It means that you can, if you want to give people jobs, you aren't like, in Joburg where you've got a law firm and your son can work there. You work for the Department of Roads, and so you have a sort of stronger patronage politics in rural areas, which means, therefore, that how you control your members is top-down with an iron fist. Yeah, that's how you do it. And I think that it's made worse by the fact that there is no competition in rural areas. The figures don't look like this. So you have a case where, one party, take ANC and DA, for instance, right? Both parties have lots of money, right? ANC probably has more money, but lots of money. But their share of the result is so different. ANC can take 90% some way, which is a different dynamic altogether. And so I think that for me, it's not so much the voter per se, but the material conditions in rural areas are so vastly different from urban areas that you have a different kind of electoral politics. But obviously, people may also then migrate to urban areas and vote for somebody else. So it's not cast in stone per se. And there was one question here, I've forgotten.
Votes against the elite.
Oh, will we see a similar trend? I think the way that not to the extent that you have in Britain or the US or even Italy now, there's a whole thing going on there, not to that extent. I think that what's happening in Western Europe and in the US is the kind of post-industrial crisis where many people are left behind by globalization. So it's a problem of highly industrialized societies. And here, I think we have a very different set of social and economic conditions. And so it's a yes in that people are fed up with conventional politics. That we see. We see it in the figures. That is, we see it in the swing vote, right? We see it in the low rates of turnout. And so, how I say is, why people like Malema and why people like Maimane is not because of the fact that Malema is DA, but that they're just young people. They're young people who offer a different argument, and that attracts people, I think. Vis-a-vis, a person who's going to read his whole speech and bore you to death, and then you fall asleep, and then he will think that you must just vote for them and move on. Do you know what I mean? And so I think that people are responding or are moving away from conventional South African politics. And so it's not a backlash against a system, I think, that's left them behind. We haven't gone through a big industrial phase. We didn't go through that. And so I think that the issues here are different, but it's similar in that yes, it is there will be a backlash against something. Now, will it be the kind of backlash that will create something new? A Trump, a Brexit, well, these people. I don't think so. I think that what it will create will be something that's here already, and we know it. And so, yeah, I don't see it that way. Yeah.
So 1, you have your hand up, and 3. Okay. We'll take 4 then. 4 quick questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
My question is that there's a class in Gauteng, especially Johannesburg and Tshwane. And from the figures that I've read somewhere, about 50% of the overall black middle class in South Africa sits in Gauteng.
Yes.
And the Western Cape is only 3%. Now, obviously, I don't know, they have an interest in the economy. They have an interest in that the economy the rand does not go through the roof, slumps. So what role did that middle class play in that last election?
Yeah.
Okay, hang on.
Okay, oh, sorry.
Yes, you had your hand up. Did you have your hand up? No, we're getting 4 questions. We only have 10 minutes. So, all right. Oh, you had your hand up. Sorry. So this person, yeah.
Sorry. Given the scenario with regards to the rural areas where local governments and ANC governments control it, and the draft bill that's laying in front of Parliament for chiefs to get more powers.
So I couldn't hear. Like,
The chief.
Yes, yeah.
Powers.
For chiefs to get more powers in your rural areas. So do you think that what does the opposition parties have to do differently to get their fair slice of profits from the tenants
In rural areas.
Okay, all right. 3 and then 4. Yes, 3, 4.
Voter apathy all over the world is a very big issue. And there's 2 components to my question. First of all, is it worse in South Africa or less than in other countries? And secondly, there's a big split in South Africa between the youth vote and the older vote. And it's my impression that the youth doesn't bother to register. The older ones register but don't vote. Now, how can that be changed? How can you get the youth to not only register but vote as well?
Okay, and then the last
Yeah.
question.
Yes.
Strong economy. The second question was about the traditional courts bill now in Parliament, which will strengthen the power of chiefs. The third question is about the youth vote and how you can get young people to vote. And then the fourth question, the last one, is about the public protector.
Yes.
And the second one is the ANC seems more interested in the
Yes.
ANC than
Okay.
South Africa.
All right. The middle class question. In terms of just my observation, experience, and all of that, I think that the middle class in this country, across the racial divide, has very similar interests, regardless of whether they're black or white or whatever, right? And it's in many ways, right? They live in the same neighborhoods, go to the same schools, same universities, same classes, same workspaces. It's one big middle class. Sure, it's a multiracial one, right? But it's one middle class, I think, that has the same interests, which is why you're quite right? In that this is why many people who are black and middle class are shifting their preferences, because they're thinking in the same lenses, right? And all evidence points to this, right? So if you look at, say, the Gauteng ANC, they are struggling to get lots of members because many people are leaving, right? Or they're choosing not to be involved in politics. And so it is a big issue, and I think that what's fueling it is that for purely electoral reasons, right? The ANC has shifted a lot towards trying to appease say, chiefs in rural areas who traditionally were not ANC. And that's created tensions inside the ANC, irrespective of what you think about Zuma and all of that, right? At the first point, it has been these new interests in the ANC that are more traditionalist, right? And the ANC, for many, many years, was a very liberal party. Very, very sort of pro gay rights and pro all these things. Now you have these folk who are homophobic, xenophobic, and all these things, and tensions are coming into ANC. You have this fight between those who are more liberal-minded and those who are very conservative socially around these things. That women can't be leaders and all these things. And so that for me, I think, is where the tension begins, and it just spills over, right? The second question was with what should opposition parties do differently, if I may be correct. It's a hard one because if I was a thinker or an advisor to either one of them, right? The simple solution is that democracy is a numbers game, right? It's about how many votes you can have, how many seats you control, which means that the only way that you're going to shift the balance along those lines is if you take the fight to rural areas. To do that means that you're going to have to offer those who hold power in rural areas something that they can't refuse. You have to offer them something alternative to the ANC, right? If you want to take the fight there. Or you're going to have to offer rural people another alternative to what they have. And the question, therefore, is what's it going to be, right? If I'm a very poor person in a rural area, and I know that a lot of my livelihood depends on my allegiance with this one fellow, right? Who is both a chief, a this, all in one. Why am I going to give that up to vote for you? Because people in the end make rational decisions, right? From where they sit. Obviously, from where we sit, we might think it different, but from where they sit, they're saying, hey, wait a minute, why am I going to go there when clearly if I'm aligned with this fellow, my kid gets he's going to get a job, his driver's license, life for me, will be okay. Whereas the risk is that if I roll my dice towards you, not guaranteeing that you'll win, I'll lose everything. And so it's balance, right? So it's about if you want to take the fight there, then you got to offer that constituency something that is better off than what they've got already. Because people always vote for material reasons, always, wherever they're at. Was the other question? Apathy. Yeah. I think that the trends in this country are very similar to other parts of the world. The difference is that how we calculate voter turnout is that, and this is IEC and all our polling and all this stuff, is that they tend to only look at the proportion of people who vote, who are registered, who vote, right? Other parts of the world look at people who are of voting age. So if we were to, shift our lens a bit and how we measure it, our trends are similar. Meaning, for our locals, for instance, it's the same trends as you have in France and those and that. I think that you're quite correct. The trend here is that many young people don't register to vote. That's true, and that would rather be doing other things, and that our electorate is aging and comprises of people who are working people. And so it's not only the age issue, it's also an economic issue as well, right? Which means therefore that people who aren't on the books are also people who tend to be very, very poor. And who tend to be very marginalized. Now, how do you get people interested